just put it on, and I think it's recording now. So we had the idea that we kind of continue from here, or from the topics just summarized from the last time, and like in a way, like the topics listed now could be some starting points. But I think I would propose, and also ask your opinion, like I would take some of these situations, like for example, what it would be like if you have the character as like an organizational member. What can you do with that, and how does that widen the envision and use this game maybe to make a case of that? And or it could be, for example, the GM, the games master, as a kind of like a facilitator of a project-like thing, or something else. So like taking some of these cases might kind of make it slightly even more concrete. So I would propose that we could select a case to focus in on, and kind of look at that as a possibility. But how does that sound, and do you have cases in mind?
Sounds great. I'm generally interested in the role of the game master. Maybe that's an easy way to start. And I also, like regarding these last things we said, I'm interested in this, like the contractual nature of rules, and like the degree of interpretation that it's always attached to them, because at the end of the day, when you sort of like break a rule, if the rule has a degree of vagueness, that vagueness has to be explored to a certain point, and someone has to like decide to the flexibility, the degree of flexibility. I guess the game master plays a significant role in that, so I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, like it's actually a good topic. Like shortly, like I would say like that there are many games that have a contract that we will interpret this. Like one could talk a lot about this, but I think that kind of actually summarizes it. Like it's contracted with that we interpret. The result is not the processes. So yeah, and that actually happens a lot. Any other proposals of topic? The game master, and with the dash of contractual, is a good one for me as well. But
I mean, I think we can do that, or we just also finish kind of the game, or like go through the game, because there were some we kind of went half through, and there were some. So we can either like go deeper now, or we stay on the general level and kind of see what else is there. But I'm open to both.
I was thinking actually using the game as whatever the topic is. Like, I mean, in a way, like what we went through was kind of the first half, which was the characters, and we talked about the kind of rolling the dice versus voting shortly, but we didn't talk the ship as an organization too much. But the one thing we really didn't talk about is the like how here there's the GM then that takes all of this, like the person's and the organization that they have, and then creates an adventure which can be thought of as a project. And so the one way to combine these two would be, look at this game and look at this topic of the GM through it, and that could kind of kill two birds with one stone potentially.
Amazing.
Hopefully. Any disagreements, or should like there's somewhat of a support of this GM focus and using this game as a springboard? Seems to be good topic. And now, of course, I could start, but let's start with like what kind of questions you would like to process on this topic of the GM, like as a quick round for everybody who wants to say something towards this topic, just to break my always taking up the space as a first person.
Maybe if I can just go in there also, maybe to just check in as a kind of participant in this series, and maybe to say a bit why I'm even here, why I'm interested in this. So I'm background for me is that I'm curating a residency program, and I have been doing that for 4 years, and now for this year, which would be the fifth or will be the 5th year, I'm taking on that organization myself. And that means that I have both I feel the duty or the task, but also now finally the freedom to decide what this is going to be, which direction it is going to go. And for me, it goes like that whole process goes very deeply into like what is even a residency stuff. So like basically I'm falling very soon out of frames that I have known, and I thought that participating, or like I mean when I witnessed your Money Lab presentation, I thought that this would be a fantastic way of getting myself ready to build a somewhat of an understanding of how I can consciously now kind of try out, sample, prototype, whatever.
Yes.
Even come to any grips with this process that I'm now facing, and want to kind of really also take as part of this experience. I don't want to just sit on what I think, on a programmatic form that I think I understand, but I want to now kind of begin peeling it apart and putting back together what I think could be nice. Yeah. And what was Ernie said, and I don't recall now who it was who said it, I thought was very interesting from apparently your last session, that the game master is in a sense considered a character, but particularly in the sense of like the game that he creates or the universe that he embodies is considered a character. And
yes.
Just from my kind of emotive response to that, looking back at 4.5 years curating that residency or this program here, I can very much feel like, hey, wait a minute, wasn't that kind of what happened? That this kind of the thing, I was handed, I was appointed or given the possibility to do this, and in 2017, and somehow I've always had this feeling that somehow there's a character, or like, it was hard to peel apart who was what, what was the program, or if there was even anything like the program other than maybe me or the people who ran it. And so this is, I don't want to draw it too close now to myself, but this would be something that I would be very interested in understanding, this kind of characterization of, how to say, what I'm saying.
Yes. And I do think it can come, especially I think towards, once we start this, like towards the end. So if we take this game master now as a process, like towards the end of this session, I think there might be points to highlight from whatever we have discussed, because I think they might serve to point how this can exist. Like, because I do think like the game master and even the world can be thought of as a character. It's wider than a character per se, but it's the same structural root from where the character comes from. Like it's roughly speaking, you could say also responsibility. You could say the character is really somebody's responsibility from the frame of a person, and then the game master's responsibilities from the frame of the world. But even that is kind of simplifying a bit. But both of these are kind of, I think, valid directions to look at it towards it. Because that also, the frame of something allows to generalize. It could be the frame of something completely different. It could be the frame of a nation, or frame of the weather, like, and this actually happens in certain games, that somebody is actually kind of like not a person but the weather, or somebody is the time. There's a couple of games that have that it's actually the person who talks about the time passing and has the responsibility and the voice of time in a way. So yeah, just examples. But towards this question of the games master, anybody else who wanted to introduce questions they want to process?
Yeah, I find it very interesting, this how the game and the game master are somehow, I don't know, affecting each other or producing each other in a way.
Mm-hmm.
I just a couple of things that came to my mind when I was thinking about game masters is maybe the style, like choosing a style of being a game master, which is connected also to a character.
Mm-hmm.
And then the tools, like what kind of tools do I have?
Yeah.
As a game master, and yeah, like exactly like this frame, like what's the agency, or what's maybe the narrative frame that I set or have.
I will actually, meanwhile, the questions are coming in. I'll stop sharing my screen for a moment because I want to pick another example in terms of how your questions are going. I'll kind of bring it in, but I have to kind of go to the internet. Meanwhile, it doesn't take me long, but anyway, like, because I want to bring it in to show another kind of example of the game master being codified in a way. Like, so we can continue, but just giving the reason why I'm stopping the screen sharing for now. So, so yeah, but that I think it is an actually interesting topic, and like in this case, in this particular game that we're seeing like this the list of the kind of semi-random dice roll adventure generator, which of course doesn't give you the whole adventure. Now, when I stop screen sharing, of course you cannot check it unless you click the link by yourselves. But it's this sort of like a list of things that. What is interesting about that is like if you compare it to, say, a ledger of a company, that ledger as a document of that has this sort of nature of defining what do we do as an organization, but it's often or almost always like a thing that is based on like paragraphs of text. Now, what if a thing like a ledger is more like a generator? Like you use that to generate different situations. And there was actually a couple of good comments even last time that you could use that to generate scenarios. That was, I think, there you said this, that it's not that you exactly start immediately doing what the scenario is, but it's you use it to kind of create this sort of points of contemplation. That if you look, kind of create a list of words on one topic or a list of phrases on another topic, and we use those to create combinations, those become these sort of potential considerations that fit our area because we selected the words in the first place. And I do think that kind of possibility comes immediately from this particular game and its kind of nature of the of how it defines the game master. But meanwhile, I have to look at the index of where is it? I have to go to page 80. So just a second. So I'm picking up a rather sort of famous game, which is um, um, called Apocalypse World, and particularly it's famous for a concept called Powered by the Apocalypse that is it has produced many games, but it's known as kind of rewriting in its own way certain kind of, let's say, a history of practice from, say, 20 years and putting it in sense of rules. It's kind of like created this sort of like, here's a conception of how we have been playing as practices, but I'll make rules for it. And its sense of game master, well, it names it master of ceremonies, or MC, but it's actually kind of codified, and this is what's on the screen now. So so I'll quickly go through. There's a couple of important pages, but I'll show from the beginning. So how it works is actually you have this sort of agenda, and you see these 3 bullet points, which are kind of like rules less principles. Like maybe slightly more on the principle side of things, but the rule is that you have to adhere to the principles. One could put it that way. So here it's really like make the world seem real, make the players' characters' lives not boring, play to find out what happens, which is actually now famous because many people like this. Like if you take them seriously, like of course the world seeming real is about that it's not a story and it's not like pre-scripted and so on. Like the lives are not boring is something. But then the last one, the play to find out what happens. If you take the literary, and there's a lot of conversation around this, means that you're not knowing what happens. So you're not setting a goal per se, but you're setting a premise. And you might be setting a premise like, we work this way, we have this sort of like interest here, but we don't actually know where we're exactly going, but we know quite a bit from where we're starting and how we're set up, what is our stance when we start. And this is what the play to find out what happens wants to code. And of course, the text here is really just putting more definition on that. Then we have this always say what the principles demand, which is what was above, but what the rules demand, which is the rest of the book, what the prep demands, which is what you have prepared, and what honesty demands, which is, I think, defined as your kind of sense of like what is your best read of how the situation goes. And it's a kind of colorful game. So now we come to the principles per se. So these are really kind of semi moves. There's even moves for Game Master, but these are some of the principles are also kind of move-like principles. So so your first rule says, well, it's called Bar Forth Apocalyptica. It's an apocalypse world. It's about the sort of world ending, or kind of. So your first rule is kind of, well, cultivate an imagination full of harsh landscape, garish, bloody images, grotesque juxtapositions, etc., and so on. Address yourself to the characters, not the players. Make your move misdirect. Like when you're making moves, you're using the moves, but you're not talking directly of the move, but you're trying to make it exist in the real world rather than seeming like a move you're making. And so forth, like make your move, never speak its name, look through the crosshairs, name everyone, make everyone human, ask provocative questions and build on the answers, and so on. And it's probably a lot of text, but I'll show this as the last one. And then you have moves. So it actually kind of gives the game master as like any player, and tries to codify them in moves. Now it's a whole lot of conversation, maybe not for here, is like, what is the concept of move here? Because it's a very much more dynamic and open than your move in chess. But in a very, very short, rough form, how I could describe it is that the actual game is a discourse. It's actually defined here as conversation. So it kind of follows the freedom of a conversation. But how the move happens is that you either recognize the shape or the pattern of the move, like, oh, this seems like you're trying to defy danger, for example. And then you suddenly introduce the mechanics in that moment, because you know that that move exists for the players. And similarly, like for the game master here, like let's say here, separate them. Like this is kind of like there's no actual mechanic of this is actually exactly what you must do to separate them, but you have this sort of principle / move of you're trying to push them to be separate, and it's up to them to come together, and you're creating a dynamic on it. So so you can push to separate them, you can push to capture someone. Always think of putting somebody in a spot, which means like a situation where they really have to make a decision. It's like a stressful trade harm for harm. Like if they go for harm, try to find a harm to them, etc., etc. And the interesting thing about this, it doesn't seem like much, but it actually kind of works. And you could use this kind of approach or something similar to define roles in an organization as well. So while like one can see from the years of playing, I think this is near 10 years old, the original game, and now there's about 100 different games made with this same engine, that you can see that actually this kind of structure works. It does affect how you play, even though the moves are somewhat loose and dynamic. But if they would not be there, you would think about your playing differently. And then one can, of course, shift this to a question, could similar things could be thought in an organization? It's a much more hands-on, direct, but also much more, in a way, loose take on principles. They are not, high up, nailed to the wall, but it's more like, I'm playing with these principles, and then let's change one of your principles to see how that affects your behavior. But you're like thinking of them as filters when you're considering what to do. That would be maybe my way of practically describing it. You're thinking of what you say, you do. You're kind of thinking of these filters and using these filters to color or condition of your reactions. Okay, yeah, that I wanted to introduce this because it comes from the same culture as this Lasers and Feelings, but also I think precisely towards this question of a game master, it's one of the most known discourses in terms of 10 years ago changing the paradigm of the games master. But yeah, I should shut up now for this.
Sorry, just to understand that last part where you said that the introduction of the moves, this formalization, so to speak, was the most known, like has remained one of the most known kind of interventions. Was that what you said? Just because I didn't capture it.
Yes, it's that and the rest. Like the moves is a big part of it, but it's actually also the other approaches. There's some. It would maybe take too long for me to go now. What are the other interesting things? How to approach? It has a pretty interesting concept of how to. I give one example. It has a pretty interesting concept to how to approach to write what would be normally considered like NPCs, like non-player characters, or in say a plot of fiction would be considered as persons who are like not protagonists. And this is a concept called fronts. And what is different in this game is that you essentially have the system of them moving. They rather than being static or pre-scripted, they have certain conditions and they will surprise you as well. Like you don't write them, but you actually have more like systems of how they will react to things and so on. Like that's another example. There are some others, but it's but yeah, like also this sort of idea of like a game as conversation, which doesn't really exactly start in this game, but like it's one that really then created rules that if we take this kind of game as a conversation, what kind of rules can we create for that? Yeah. Which is, of course, interesting also for organization, because much of organization is conversation, widely speaking. Any other questions, comments on that?
This definitely, I feel, cements the position of the game master as a player, I believe.
Yes.
But I think it's interesting because of the framing, basically, how the game master is sort of like in feedback loop that is more conscious of the rest of the players, whereas a character is more seeing the world through their own eyes in a more individual manner. So I just think that it is interesting, this nuance between how aware you are of the whole flow and how focused you are on your own particular situation.
Yeah, I think this kind of difference, I mean, there was a good reason when it started, because it's kind of like repeating structures that, especially the character, the player, is a structure that we know. It's the sense of it's someone else, but it's like you. It's easy to set up on, relatively speaking. And the one thing I won't dig into deeply, but when kind of role playing started, was extremely weird and hard for people to understand. There is this whole series of essays about how there was like 5 years of hallucination of trying to figure out what this kind of play was, and like also a good book on it, but which I can give references at some point. But so having this sort of safe form of, okay, I can at least understand because I'm a person, and then this other, if you're a person, it's kind of the easiest relation that then there is a world response to you. Well, the world might be another person, it might be the weather, it might be architecture, whatever. But it's kind of makes the player, so it was like makes this easy for the players, and then the game master was the one who takes the sacrifice and kind of serves the players, but then at the same time gets this power of defining a lot of the world. And generally it was considered at that time that game master is asked for more in a way, but that this can create a situation that can make the play possible. But I think in the last 10, 20 years, whatever you place it, there has been a realization that actually the forms underneath are much more general. So it doesn't have to be the world, doesn't have to be the character, and therefore you see these games where it's the weather and so on. But I do think, like now looking at our topic, like for example, if I would place a question, could I use this apocalypse world paradigm, or the so-called apocalypse engine paradigms, to create, let's say, a project facilitator, or even like any member of organization structuring? I would definitely answer yes. Like I think it actually would be interesting, and I think it's a harder question for you because I've shown you a little bit, but knowing, having read it, and knowing also what's in the paragraphs and so on, I think it actually would be rather refreshing. Maybe that's the simple way of putting it, because it would because like its take on principles, they sound like principles, but there is a kind of both more practical and more flexible approach in them, and I do think that would be actually rather useful, and doesn't really exist now that I think about it. Like at least I don't know such existence in organizations.
I'm wondering, I'm sorry, if someone else wants to talk, that's totally fine. I'm gonna keep riffing about this. Are there games where there's more than one game master, or that multiple game masters control different aspects of the world?
Yes and yes. So to answer shortly, like because it's a big topic, but so there are not that many. It's almost like you're looking at this sort of very small examples, but inside these very small examples, you have a huge palette. Like you have games where you have like essentially almost like areas of responsibility. and that, okay, I take this, like I'll take the weather, and I take the city. One of the games we actually started with XORG is a game called Universalis, which is interesting because it's based completely on tokens, but you also use tokens by slotting your own tokens to gain this responsibility. So you gain the voice of the city or the weather or the river or the character or really whatever, the moss in the world, like whatever you can define by slotting tokens on it. And this can be challenged by others putting tokens. But so that's a very, very flexible general case on that. But you have many others. So it's not the norm, but you have, like, in the non-norm, in the fringe, you have a huge amount of variety on this. And you have rotating games masters, you have dueling game masters, you have game masters that have like slightly like counterpart roles, like somebody provides the challenges, the other one provides the, I don't know, the continuation and things like this. Yeah, but yeah. Any questions, comments, Jakob, there?
Yeah, like I liked what you said, that these kind of things like the principles, the moves, the agenda, or like things like that they're kind of filters when you're considering how to move on and so on. So and I think like I somehow like that because it's really, I mean, like I think like I have these many voices in my head constantly, and I think any of us does, like coming from whatever different experiences we had maybe, or yeah, like things we find important, like morals or whatever somebody told us once, or things like that. And I think it's really interesting to add voluntarily, like to really design and add to them whatever you want to add in a way.
Actually, you're really on point. This is very much how it is. Like that, you take your whole experience, but you gain the sort of, like, I could add on top of this. Like I could, and it actually is in practice. Like if you look at good game masters, it's very patchworky often. It's like I take this list of principles, and I like it, and then I cut 5 of them because I think it's slightly too long, and that becomes my instrument really. And that instrument I put on a paper that is like 5 centimeters next to my head, so I can always check it, and then it has more effect, which is very patchworky. But then going back to our to dance between Zoom and this, but here you have the patchwork of, you have this sort of small list of, like, you can throw these dice that you get certain kind of a agent, which is the threat, and it's kind of trying to go to the paradigm of Star Trek. So you have the threat who wants to do certain things, so it's a factor in the world, and it has a target, like, which is and the consequence of that is this. So that is a tool in itself. And then actually you have this short paragraph. I mean, it's supposed to be a page. So this is why it's notice, by the way, that here the first sentence for the GM is play to find out how. And this game is produced after Apocalypse World, so you can see the influence here. So it's utilizing the same phrase, and the phrase here is actually kind of, as in the earlier games, kind of meant to be functional. You're kind of taking it seriously in the game, that, oh, okay, so I'm not going to pre-script, like, or I might have like ideas of the script or what could happen, but ultimately, like, I cannot shackle that because I'm playing to find out how. But to your point, like, it could also be that you could have let's say pictures of architecture. You could have a set of cards. You could have different dice pools that might define like interesting names or adjectives. It's a common tool. Is like you have verbs, nouns, adjectives, and you can kind of pick or make combinations. I'm showing this to. This is actually a quick example. I don't know if I can make it visible, and it's probably inverted. I don't know if it's inverted for you, but it's only inverted for me. Is it inverted for you?
Maybe you can take a picture and put it in the chat.
Yeah, it's not inverted. Yeah, harsh, static, vivid rainbow hues.
I'll show you through quickly. I don't show everything because it's like I'm using it as an example. So what you see is like one card. There's 120 of these in a deck, and that's the randomizer, the deck. So you can take any card. But you have these different areas. There is the circle is actually different dice rolls. It's like you get like 1 in 4, 1 in 6, etc. And like you get a different number depending on which card you get. You have this sort of odds, but then you have also like different elements and different runes. But then maybe more interestingly here is a verb, adjective, adverb, and a noun, and they are random. And then you have a hearing, a kind of sound element, like harsh static in this case. And then you have a seeing, you have something to touch, and you have something to smell. Then you have names, you have a list of belongings or items, you have a catalyst, which is like a trigger of an event or a vector, you have a location, you have a sense of virtue and vice. But the whole thing is not meant to be used everything. You're pulling something and saying like, I need inspiration for a sense of a place, and maybe I'll look at different sites, or I need this sort of like I need an idea. I randomly pick certain verbs, adjectives, nouns, and then see what they trigger for me. And the thing is, like, you can almost have a palette, like a painter would have a palette, or a musician would have a set of instruments. In these kind of games, the game master can have their palette. It's not everything. It might be the rules, but it also might be certain things that they use to pick things, like which is not completely random at all. They might pick like a certain kind of word list because they like it, and they use it in the sense of like it's not a command for them, but it's from the selected palette that is somehow all of them are triggering things that you think are important, but then you use the one you get as kind of like, what if it was this? What if it was, what other words here? I'm working with this. Like it's eternal. I'm reading it upside down. I'll have to check. Oh, we have halt, eternal, underling. Like so underling, for example, like or halt underling. Like so what could that be like? So is it about halting the concept of an underlingness, and that to bring the structure somehow away from the sense of an underling, or is it about like halting a process that is going under, etc.? And that is kind of giving you an option, which you might completely discard. So this just as an example, quickly, a snapshot really of what Thea was describing, of this sort of adding to your own presence, and then not just adding randomly, but actually creating this palette of how you think. And things like rules are part of that, but there is a larger culture, which is all kinds of things you add on top of that. And that might be, yes, a script of what could happen, but I think nowadays less and less so, and rather more in this sort of like things that you think are in the vicinity you would like to see, but they are not in strict order, kind of thing. But might be more like inspirational. That's the way to put it. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd have a question. If and maybe you spoke about this already. If you conceive of the game master or of the world that they represent to be a character, does that not make the transition between who owns the world very kind of, movable, very mobile? I mean, doesn't that make was it Pablo? I think you said that then there's this perspective difference, and you said, well, maybe it's more because one has the overview at maybe of this chart or of the rule book or what, and then and the others don't. But doesn't then become like everybody with the world to one another, or do you then lose the game moment when you lose that definition, or do you lose what is are you catching where I'm trying to
Yeah. I think I'm catching it. Yes, and I would say I think it's actually a good thing. Oh, you have to be knowledgeable what happens, but essentially, like when people are playing in the sense that you get certain responsibilities, as long as you have the sense of who has responsibilities of what, it actually works, and it then expands your range quite significantly. Like in a way, you have this mixing and merging already in the level of that people are responsible for the characters, because sometimes, of course, an event might be affected by one character or another, or somebody completely else, or the weather is affecting the character. So what actually happens becomes this sort of moment of indeterminacy, which is where things like dice or decisions come in. So the mixing and merging is already kind of part of these games. So the having a strict limit is not necessarily so important. But to give an example towards this current also topic of ours, if one would think that when you define something project-like, doesn't have to be a project because you could challenge the paradigm of a project in an organization. But you could define the person who is, let's say, hosting the project or traditionally thought as leading the project. What if that person was a game master? And then, but it's another project, it's another person. And knowing seeing what I've seen in games, I don't think that would be a problem at all. I mean, that's actually a rather easy way of thinking, even though you could see project and another project sometimes merging, then you would simply bring both of the voices in, and it would be their discourse or everybody's discourse of what happens. But generally, these kind of moments actually are interesting catalysts. They might create problems, but just as often they create the point where something new is born, because there is suddenly this question, oh, what's your opinion? What's your opinion? And they differ, so let's actually have a discussion between this difference, and that in itself is a point of growth. So I think that such a concept, for example, of that you would define a project, but you would kind of start from the paradigm of the game master, and potentially everybody else being players, or even having a rotating game master in a project, or however you would approach it, would be a rather viable example of this more limited areas rather than the world for the game master.
In the domain where I work with, mainly like people representing other types of institutions or being independent practitioners, I think the most kind of analog description would be to say that any interaction is more probably like game masters from different games meeting one another in a way, so sometimes, there's almost, yes. It's kind of all sorts of rule sets and ambitions and game and goals or whatever, currencies that somehow then, I don't know if you then encounter this idea of translatability or convertibility, or I don't know what's coming up, but that's, everybody's like, for everybody else is a player in the other's game or something like that.
But it's also like, you can think of, I mean, for example, if I use this rotating game masters concept, like it's completely possible, like if you're having a meeting between game masters, so to speak, it's like, okay, now you're the game master, and then the next hour or next session, it's the other one, and so on. and this can also actually be quite positive. Like, I'm not saying it's always, but it's generally considered a quite a valid and interesting approach, because you're getting different points of view in and of themselves. Like, and I do think, like, referring back to this sort of the other example I brought, the apocalypse world and the engine in it. So, so for example, there's the sentence here, the last principle, which is after every move you make, your list of moves, what do you do? Which means ask, what do you do? I mean, once again, doesn't seem much, but it's actually quite functional. That is, whenever you're challenging the situation, whenever you're pushing something that is kind of potential reaction from others, you immediately turn it to them and ask, what do they do? And if I translate that in like drafty manner into a situation where the game master would be, let's say, the project leader, what if a project leader would throw not exactly what you should do? They wouldn't be just about, you know, giving you tasks, but they would like throw speculative questions, or like, what if this happens? What do you do? Or if like, here's a scenario, what do you do? Which would be very game mastery in nature. But such rules might be an interesting mix in terms of how do we think about somebody leading or facilitating or somehow organizing um, um, a task or a project particularly, and such techniques might be quite useful in terms of this. And as a kind of final point on this, like, of course, like, it's also possible to, like, you have roles where the game master is the one who initiates, but then the decision might be general. Like, for example, maybe the game master, like thing, like person, sets a premise, but then the decision might be voting, or might be actually decided by somebody else who is more responsible or knowledgeable about the particular topic. So you have systems that mix this also, like that, like, in a way, like, if in that situation, you could almost think that the game master is the one who kind of like pushes things forward, and that they're kind of like taking this responsibility of bringing things on the table. But then it's maybe everybody who decides what happens with this new ignition push created by the game master like character. But yeah, so that's I think it's an interesting ground overall. This game master as a project, um, like the paradigm of the project leader, whatever concept. And secondly, I do think the kind of approach is coming from this, having this palette we were talking earlier, is actually a really interesting way of designing, like, what kind of things you would give. Like, is it principles? Is it principles plus certain things that you keep in always in mind? Is it like what kind of rules you set for that game master like character creates a design space which is wider than uh, a job description, so to speak, or something like that.
Yeah, just to summarize this, I think the main difference, like in this cultural approach from organizations and games, it's that organizations have like this focus on the planning, which has a degree of controlling and predicting outcomes, while game masters and games in general are committed to emergent properties, right?
Yes.
So like it's such a simple lens to achieve mostly similar things.
Yes.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's just the same thing you said. I'm just rephrasing it.
No, but sorry. Can I just add a question to the question? Pablo, what you were saying, is it not, Echo, you were saying earlier that this idea of play to find out is historically new. And is it not like, well, Pablo, if you say like that, you kind of like, because my question, if I refer back to my own context, which is the reason why I'm, you know, try to join you, I think I'm trying to work toward an organization that is there to find out, like, you know.
I'm actually both good points. Like maybe just to add a couple of words to what I said to Pablo is, I would say roughly speaking, yes. Like you're right on this, that the games are about emergent properties and organization are often about prediction, but they overlap much more than people normally think. And towards this play defined being a new concept, it's a new conception, and this was or the kind of Apocalypse World was interesting because it was a game that kind of started with this conception pre-made when the design was started, and then thinking like, how does the design change from this? But it wasn't a new practice per se. It just wasn't so conceptually defined beforehand. So you can find, even if you go back to early 70s, even before the games really existed as a name, people who practiced kind of like playing to find out. But the thing was, it wasn't really sensed like this. It actually, the pathway first was to kind of actually go where organizations are, is to actually create more predictability to behavior first, and then failing at that for many. And then there was this other fringe, which was smaller, which was kind of embracing the quality of playing to find out, but not really having concepts for it. And why this was kind of picked up from this Apocalypse World was because it kind of coined this and then said, okay, what does it mean that we actually embrace this conceptually, and how does it kind of approach differently or create different approaches to how we play? And it's nothing perfect, but it did actually kind of succeed in some ways, recognizing that there are certain kind of paradigmatic changes to your process and behavior, and some of them, what it did, were somewhat good ones. So that's maybe a slightly more nuanced description of what happened. But as a kind of summary, I do think actually like organizations overthink of what they can actually predict. And on the other hand, when the games play to find out, it's not about random. Like, yes, anything might happen, but you want to create tendencies. You want to create likelihoods of a certain thing, because you don't just want like whatever happens. You want, for example, genre, you want certain kind of events. You might have an idea or desire to see a certain kind of event. The thing is, you don't chain lock that, because that kind of ruins the game. But you do generally, or you are able to create these sort of tendencies. And this creates these two, the organization side and the game side, are actually much closer, and there is a ground where they really overlap. And this is why I think there is this possibility of expanding what the organization is, using this sort of game approaches, and seeing the kind of other side of the field, and seeing how it systemizes itself. Because I could make the argument that actually games are more systematic. These kind of games, or certainly other games, are more systematic. Like organizations are systems, yes, but in games the system tends to be more present. So even though they might be playing towards not a strict outcome, they actually have more systems for whatever they're looking for in these tendencies.
Just as a note on the side, what I think I could be interested in also is the question of how are these, both in organization and in games, how are these or these systems carried onward? Like, how are they memorized? Who is, where are they actually stored? Because the least of us look at this paper, more than once or so to play a game, but we retain a certain memory, I would suppose. Yeah, but both also on the organizational side.
You mean like examples, like the physicality of it, like for example, do you have it on paper or computer, or like what are the kind of artifacts, like
More than
or
that, I think more than that, it's I mean, just if I speak about this residency program, the funny thing is like it until like just weeks ago, it didn't have any. I mean, we knew it would take place, we being all those involved, but it didn't have really any written thing or anything kind of. But it was obvious that it was there, you know, that it existed. So like there is a certain. And also, I mean, if you think from the other end, what happens if an institution dies? Like, what happens to that memory? And like, so where is that all carried? Again, both on the game side and on the organization side.
No, this is a really interesting question, a big question, but I think it's interesting because it's both practical, but it's also very wide. Because just kind of couple of quick dives on different spots on this. Like, first of all, there is a difference in quality in games and organizations of how you can approach this. And one of the things I would highlight from this difference is that the game side generally, especially in this sort of like more fringe games, like deeper in the game culture, people are more ready to define speculatively. That would be a concept I would use. You could also use fiction, but I think speculatively here is good. So in this sense, like I could use an example of, for example, this concept of playstorming, which is like you start playing when you have one rule, and then you imagine the rest of the rules outside of that rule. Like you have this sort of like, oh, we are characters defined by like picking words from this list, whatever it is. And then, okay, now we are this, and now we don't have a rule for creating a situation, but let's say we have these characters, and then somebody comes up with, well, the situation is created by everybody contributing one sentence. I'm just making this up now, but okay, now we created the situation around this, and the game is actually kind of imagined around. And if it's also found that certain parts that are proposed are considered not good, then there might be change on the fly. It's like imagine, like setting the first floor of a house and the first wall, and then going into the house at that point and imagining the house around that and kind of building it as it goes. And that's a kind of example. Of course, it's rather from hardly like fairly hard from the other end, but I do think it points to a kind of cultural quality that these kind of games, like you could create the sense of a game to just to get in there, and then say, okay, actually we'll change this now, and like we change these rules, and it's like it might be a certain agreement and so on, but generally there's more, let's say, preference or readiness is maybe the word I was looking for. Readiness to be playful with definition. That's maybe a good phrase for it. Games are more ready to be playful with definition. Like, game is a definition. This game here is defining everything that it says, but it can be more playful. What is how written in stone the definition is? And I do think that is a useful practice. And the kind of approaches that are in this practice are also rather useful. That's one thing I would think that is immediately useful to think about. And of course, this relates to end of things or continuation of things, and that is really a huge topic. Which would be very interesting. Like, for example, what is the sense of the world in these kind of game cultures? How it actually has had a huge invisible impact on culture. Like, for example, why Star Wars wouldn't exist without role-playing games, or would exist in a very different forms, because it was actually thought of as a paradigm of just three movies, and ended. But then, because it was ended, it was very cheap to buy the license, and there was created this role-playing game like this out of Star Wars on this cheap license, because Lucasfilm thought it's dead. And then this role-playing game created a huge world, defined these characters and races, and then about 5-6 years later, the people in Lucasfilm like look at these books and said, "Whoa, we have all this," and then they took this stack of books, gave it to fiction writers, and said, "This is your Bible, the game books," and said, "Actually, we have this world. Here's the books that define this world." And I think it was Timothy Zahn who was then made to restart Star Wars by creating novels, and he was given the game books as like, okay, like this, if you want to know about that race or this race or that planet, look at these books. And they were created outside of Lucasfilm. They like were not really, but the reason was that the game culture already had this paradigm of like how there is the speculative worlds, and if you look at nowadays, there is this like common understanding this of this sort of multiple worlds, parallel worlds, like some games are playing with the idea that you might have an archetypical character that is said to exist in the world, but of course, because the game is being played in many rooms and places in the world, so it's always a different character and it's presented by different people. But some people are actually playing that all of those are real, that all, like your version of this character and this version of this character are all real, and this is the actual ontology of the world. And then we play with that by creating crossovers with this. So this is a thing that is, for example, happening, and I think that is all pointing to a versatility of like things don't just exist or not exist, but actually the speculative existence is a medium to play, and the kind of formalizations we create there is a kind of part of human culture that is used and has been used from time immemorial, but it's a wider perspective. And some of these games from the last decade or so and how they're playing with this is an interesting precursor of some things that are, I think, entering the culture at large, just like the sensible world that entered through Star Wars and now Marvel doing the same thing of being a world rather than a story, were actually developed in this sort of after Dungeons and Dragons, post Dungeons and Dragons role-playing games, which is actually admitted by some of the people in Lucasfilms, the conceptual people. So yeah, it's a big topic.
Yeah, I love this existence. You call it speculative existence. I just want to say like existence without substrate in a way. Like of course it's not without substrate. Like but yeah, it's so I told stories to my kids when they were 7, 9, I think. We ran out of books to read, and then we just began making up stories, and that turned into a kind of a movie series kind of per night.
Yeah.
And I know that if I were to go back now, pick up on those stories, the world would still completely be there.
Yeah.
And I know we know the folks who populated those things. It's many years ago now. And what I think is really interesting on like coming back again to where I'm coming from, talking with you, I was just writing down the sentence like about this residency organization, like what would need to happen for it not to exist anymore? You know, like because it's there. I mean, there's and like so what would really pull the plug on it? You know, not just funding, because funding obviously is a huge issue, but that's not the only thing. So like somehow there is an organization, even we might not have an architectural space to kind of re-stimulate the realization of its existence, or like so what's the thing that I need to but yeah, sorry, super interesting.
I think it's an interesting topic, and in itself, like also like not to exist is one way to approach the question, but also like thinking of what remains and what kind of travels forth. I like often thought like current organizations would benefit of thinking like, what if they put a game out of themselves and saying, well, you can play this, and then you can call yourself this organization or this organization plus a sign, or like a slight variant of the name, but you have the right in a way like do everything within that. So I mean, this is precisely starting to play with this sort of speculative world, which contains these concepts like parallel worlds and so on, and kind of can contain those kind of possibilities, because I do think they're very present, and they are also pragmatic, because they are, you could say, like similar qualities exist in also open source projects, but this is also kind of a different take on that, not excluding the kind of open source approach of different wings developing the same software or different branchings of the software. There's a structural similarity. But all of this actually points out to me that there is a case here, just to kind of not propose in the sense that we should do this, but just as an option possibility, is that if one would reimagine running a project, but kind of form this sort of, what if we start from the game master paradigm and imagine what kind of project-like nature that can create and what kind of form could be given to it. Because it's a very wide, but it doesn't have to be super long and convoluted form. Like, you could create a game master-like role with 3 sentences. I mean, if you look at this Lasers and Feelings, it's 3 paragraphs, which are not just like descriptive text. They are actually fairly well written, and then it's a random list. That's all. So it can be fairly small, but it can create different tendencies, and those can also project to a different quality of what a project then is, because it can also contain or expand to how are the project players, so to speak, defined, the other players than the game master like participants, other participants, and that would be an interesting form that could culturally create a different sense than what is our current sense of projects here and now by the current conventions of organization.
That sounds good. I just want to comment one thing on Martin and this notion of where are organizations stored. That reminded me of there's this indigenous activist in Mexico, Yasnaya Aguilar, and she talks a lot about oral tradition and how it's often like there's these state-driven initiatives to preserve oral tradition, and they like write books compiling oral tradition, and how that's actually destroying oral tradition, because the medium of oral tradition is memory, right? It's if you write it down, then it misses the whole point. So it just reminded me of that notion of what is the medium where culture is stored, right?
Yeah.
And coming back to the games, my brother, I'm not sure if you can see it, my brother sent me a Commodore 64 some time ago, so we're kind of cracking that thing open, where my boys have been playing with their PlayStation and all the stuff, and so we began playing the Rick Dangerous again, and my brother was complaining that was one of the worst level design jobs ever done, because there's these kind of contraptions popping up everywhere that you can't know about, and so and I was just, before he said that, I was just looking at the levels and I was noticing the issue, but I said, like, how, I was thinking to myself, I say, like, how amazing is this that in this level you cannot get through if you don't remember what's going to happen to you. And that's the thing that I'm not seeing in Fortnite anymore, or what my kids are playing. Sorry, this completely side thing, but I really think that this kind of the space of imagination making a space for an organization is super interesting. And what I also had to think about is, like, I studied in Eindhoven, that is this kind of design academy where there was this Lee Edelkort, huge guru figure, who kind of drove the school to its kind of fame. One thing that she could amazingly well do is implant scenarios in your mind. She was a game master more than anything. She was just able to just conjure up so much of a future that there was no question what we would be doing there.
Yeah,
it was very obvious. And like now I work with this with a very kind of somewhat equally like similarly structured space in Russia, and they also have a person there who is this master of ceremony, this kind of game master guy. Like he can just like really throw out a universe for you, and after that the organization is almost already built. You know, like I mean, of course they have amazing folks also on running the logistics and everything, and they have a nice space and money, but in terms of fleshing out what is the purpose and how does this thing function, there's so much of telling. There's so much of like being able to project a strong kind of world. I think that's what went on there, and that carries. I mean, like in their case anyway. I mean,
yeah, and this is organization as a world, which is kind of there is a high overlap. That it is like an aquarium in a way, like of course not necessarily completely closed and having relations with things outside of it, other organizations, but nevertheless it has this sort of quality of being its own world, which is why this overlap is and does exist. And I do think it's interesting in this, like also that kind of points out to another kind of possible direction is like if you start from a game master's position and defining, but his or her or their task is not to define an adventure or even a world, but precisely as you're describing an organization. But as the speculative reality, like here's my way of running this for you, which I created, let's say, in one day, as often currently game masters are quite fast at creating this whole semblance of a world. And then that becomes a test case. And what can be done with that? That's an interesting possibility, especially in looking at these techniques and as a kind of way of, well, experimenting, exploring what a potential organization can be. Because, like, I don't remember who this was talked about, but some sessions ago in this, like that there is this sort of overlap between these kind of techniques and the fact that organizations are conventionally thought of as rather long-term things that they want to last years and years. So therefore, it's rather useful to have quick techniques, because if you spend some days or weeks exploring the possibilities before you start honing down what the organization is, that time is rather short compared to the lifespan of the potential organization. So therefore, the sensibility of spending, say, 12 hours is actually rather rather useful. So I think that's also a kind of interesting direction to think about overall. I think that is a really interesting wing and potential sub-project. Like I was thinking on the side, like proposing for next time, actually this universalis, and kind of looking at the token model and how that can work with the sort of defining anything and sharing responsibility. But also these kind of directions, what are being talked about here, might be something of a direction of continuation, and maybe even I think it would be good to kind of constantly kind of focus the camera a bit more and make this sort of, let's call them speculative cases. They don't have to be anything finalized designs, but I think like coming up with what if the rule was this, or the principle was this, or what if the game master had this kind of a set, is ultimately the best way to learn this kind of practices and also see alternatives and strengths and weaknesses of this kind of form. So I think whatever case we pick, I think looking towards such direction of practical cases would be a useful thing.
Sorry, just did you play a game already together?
Yeah, like especially before the Money Lab, when we were doing like early tests, we've done playtesting on a couple of cases, and I think we should probably try to encourage to return to that, because both were actually rather successful. And one of the reasons we thought, okay, this is kind of ready to go or interesting. So we tried I made a very small hack where I turned the universalis and the token model into this distributed version of the charter idea of organization. So the charter being usually this document that defines what the organization is, but it was, rather than a text, it was actually this first a discourse, just talking. So very shortly, Universalis, I think, has some very good decisions. There's also some others that I changed, but like one of the good decisions is everything can be talked about and have a sort of an existence, but once somebody places a token on something, can be a phrase, can be one word, really anything that they frame out of the conversation, it changes reality. It becomes a fact in the game's language. Doesn't mean that all the other things that are said don't exist at all, but it gains a different kind of sense of presence and reality. And this became an interesting part in the organization because it allowed for this to be used in a kind of definitional role. Oh, okay, this is something that the organization recognizes because somebody placed their token on that. And of course, the distribution of those tokens, etc., can be done in any manner. It can be, everybody gets the equal amount. It could be whatever or like distribution is kind of a modular question from that. But that was a game we played, and it actually worked rather well because every one of them became immediately a kind of a short conversation point. Like somebody picked like, oh, my sense of how we organize ourselves was this and this phrase. And then people were asking, okay, why do you pick that word and this word? And this was actually very fertile, a focused conversation, because then it became actually questions that are useful for definition. But so there was a rule that whenever somebody placed it down, others could challenge it, but ultimately, like some form of it would remain. And this allowed both a kind of discourse, a little bit of a challenge, but also the power to say, this is important to me. This is why I placed the token here. So this was one example we played, and we played another which was based on a hack of a game called Microscope, which is also a very interesting case towards imagining organizations, because it's so highly structured, but also quite free. But yeah, so we have had some playtests, and I think those should return as well.
Me personally, I would be totally up for that.
Yeah. I think we could try that. I think precisely this sort of like having some model that is interesting, but also hacking it a bit. And I can also, I mean, everybody else can take part, but I can also provide some hacking towards these structures. That's something that is kind of easy enough to doesn't have to be perfect, but like to make them more like pertinent, for example, for the question of organization itself. Like actually, yeah, like for example, this role definition, if you would take like different forms of, like the game master as whether it's a project runner or whatever kind of, you would replace the position of leadership rather with that, which is more facilitator but different. But then you would also use these forms that define a character, a player, and you would maybe use some interesting models from games to test out how they work for an organization. I think there is some playtest that you could use from that ground. It's a huge area. There's many ways to conceive and structure what a player is, or there's less for the game master because it's a newer concept to actually formalize that or systemize that. But there are still options even in that case. So that's a possible playtesting direction as well.
I was just wondering because I think now Jakob and Thea both had to go.
Yeah, I think usually we have this rule that it's roughly an hour. This has been rather longer, but I think we're which I'm gracious, but I think we're finding a closure, like in some ways, like um, so so yeah, Thea sent a message that she had to go to another meeting, but I think the one final thing would be at least to um, like if there are any wishes for the next time or the next direction, that could be the closure moment.
So for me, I wouldn't mind. Also, maybe in sense of courtesy to now those who are not here to vote on that, I would think that maybe doing one more kind of analytic or diagnostic round, maybe on the token side, could be nice, and then maybe decide together what one could game, like what one could try. I do need to attach minimally a probable warning that my wife is extremely pregnant right now, and so we might there might be some interruptions to my participation once again. So
as it happens with pregnancy.
As it happens.
Yeah.
But I think it could be great to look into the, even if I have to re-listen then afterward, like into the token part just on a structural level, and then to join for some gaming, because like that would, I think, would be great.
I think like let's hear, Pablo, your opinion. Or
yeah, that sounds great to me. I'm really enjoying these conversations, but at some point it would be nice to play. I'm a bit nervous about the prospect, but it would definitely be nice.
It's not hard, like especially like because one can kind of frame out certain parts of the game. You don't have to play the whole game. Many of these games actually are nowadays more and more modular. So that becomes possible. I think actually that direction, I would kind of revisit this topic that I kind of started with, the first test group, which was not even called an XORG, which was this universalis, because it was very promising, but we didn't go far there. We moved to another case just to quickly test it in different areas, because I think it's a really interesting case because it has actually a paradigm of a token from, I think it's 2003-ish, 2002. So it's way before the crypto. And I think it calls it in coins actually, but they're very token-like. That actually contains some of the thinking that is different from how, say, the crypto economy thinks about tokens and coins. And of course, crypto has developed certain interesting ideas, but in some ways, the ideas in Universalis are rather smart, and not all of that is present in whether it's current economic thinking or current crypto thinking. So, like for that, like and also the idea that it actually wants to use the tokens as a kind of enabler for universal semantic, like a general semantic, like anything can interact and be affected by these tokens, which is of course a very extreme but interesting case in the sense like it's the world, it's a story, it's everything in there, from the river to the movement of the river to whether it snows on the river, like whatever level and whatever small large framing is possible in that system. So I think that would be a really interesting, both very much in this field of what tokens are, but at the same time very much bringing some new thinking on what they can be. So yeah, that could be my proposal. And of course I can put it in the Telegram and people can react to it, but I think that would be a good topic. Yeah. So that sounds for me actually very useful and gives a practical case for a proposal for next time, unless somebody strongly protests. But we can see from that. But yes, any last words? Any sounds morbid, but final.
Just so much as thank you, and I also now need to go, but that was
Yeah.
really, I'm very happy to have made it today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for being here, and
Awesome.
same for Pablo, and also I'll message Thea as well, and Eric was here at the beginning. Okay, so until next week, hopefully I'll put a message on Telegram and also some links.
Yeah, and please, in case everybody would be okay with it, should I not be there, I would love if you could record it just for me to listen.
Yeah, I think it's completely possible now that I figured out the loop. Last time was actually kind of a hiccup, but we can like continue the practice now. It's fine. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Thank you,
everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Good evening. Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
All right.